Hello and welcome back to another full step-by-step PC build guide, and today I'm going to be showing you how to build a PC in the XPG Defender Pro. So taking a look at the other parts I'm going to be building with today, for the motherboard I'm going to be using the ASRock B650E Steel Legend Wi-Fi. For the CPU I'm going to be using AMD's 12-core Ryzen 9, the 7900X. Keeping our CPU cool, I've got a 240mm AIO from ASUS. It's the ROG RYUO 3. For RAM, I've got 32GB of Kingston Fury Beast RGB, DDR5 and 56 megatransfers per second. For storage, I'm going with a single Gen 4 NVMe M.2 drive for this build. It's the ADATA Legend 960 in 1TB capacity. Powering the whole build, I've got a fully modular platinum power supply from Cooler Master. It's the XG Plus 750 Platinum. For the graphics card, I'm going to be using the ASUS ROG Strix RTX 3080. And the final part for today's build is some white cable extensions from Cable Mod. Okay, let's get building. So as usual, I'm going to start by preparing the case, and as we go, we'll point out all the case's main features. So a tempered glass side panel is held on with two thumb screws at the back, which we need to remove. And then with the thumb screws removed, we can slide the panel backwards, tilt it out and lift away. Our other side panel is removed in exactly the same way, so we remove the thumb screws at the back, and then we're going to be able to slide the panel backwards and lift it out and away. Taking a look at our case's front I/O, we've got a power button, we've got a button to control the lighting on the fans, we've got a combined headphone and microphone jack, and we've got two USB 3.0 Type A ports. On the top of the case, we've got a magnetically attached dust filter which can simply be pulled away. The case's front panel is magnetically attached and it can simply be pulled away. Beneath the front panel, we've got a full-length nylon dust filter, and to remove it, we simply just need to pull it up from the top and lift away for cleaning. With the front panel removed, you can see the two 120mm XPG Vento 120 ARGB fans that are pre-installed at the front of the case. You can fit up to three 120mm fans, or two 140mm fans, or up to a 360 or 280mm radiator at the front if you prefer. At the rear of the case, we've got another one of these fans. If you prefer, you can mount a 120mm radiator at the rear. At the top of the case, there's no fans included, but you can fit up to two 120 or two 140mm fans, or up to 240 or 280mm radiator. In terms of motherboard support, it's up to EITX, and you're going to be able to fit a pretty large CPU cooler if you want to go down the air cooling route of up to a maximum height of 170mm. In terms of mounting your graphics card, we've got 7 horizontal slots, but as well, if you want to mount it vertically, it's great to see we've got 2 vertical slots here, although it is important to mention that the riser cable isn't included with the case. In terms of mounting the graphics card, you're going to have loads of room in this case, with graphics cards up to a maximum length of 380mm being supported. We've also got a really nice cutout in the bottom of the case for our PCIe cables with a rubber grommet on it. It is important to note that we've got a cutout at the front of the case, so your power supply is going to be visible. So make sure the side of the power supply that's going to be displayed here looks good, and it's not got a load of manufacturer specifications and text being displayed where it's going to look awful. At the bottom of the case, we've got a tray-style dust filter where our power supply's intake, and it can simply be pulled out from the back. Moving into our rear compartment, it's good to see we've got rubber grommets over the main cutouts to the right-hand side of the motherboard, and we've got plenty of other cutouts in lots of sensible places. There's also lots of cable tie-down points, and as well, the cable routing space looks to be quite good. We've got two dedicated 2.5-inch drive mounting brackets at the back of the case, and I really like their mechanism. We've got little pegs here which are going to fit through the holes in your SSD, and then a screw hole over here. So to mount the SSD, all you're going to have to do is line it up with the pegs. They're going to go into the holes in the SSD, and then you can flatten it down and screw it into place with 2 screws on this side to secure it. At the bottom of the case, we've got a hard drive cage, and it has 2 drive trays in it, which can simply be pulled out from the back. You'll notice that our second drive tray has our case accessory box in it. In each of these drive trays, you're going to be able to mount either a 2.5-inch drive, a 3.5-inch drive, or one of each. You can see our hard drive cage is screwed in at the bottom. You'll notice it looks like we've got 2 alternative mounting points. We can actually move the hard drive cage further to the front. So you can see our hard drive cage is held on at the bottom with 4 screws. And then we've got a single screw at the back. Then with all 5 screws removed, if we want to adjust the position of the hard drive cage, we can simply slide it along into one of these other 2 positions. Although I am noting it doesn't seem to be removable, it's just actually too big to fit out the side of the case. So what I'm going to do, because I'm not planning to install a front fan at the bottom, I'm going to move the hard drive cage to its position furthest forward, meaning we're going to have more space for our power supply cables at the back. Our power supply is going to go down at the bottom, and power supplies up to a maximum length of 220mm are supported. At the rear of the case, we don't have any removable power supply brackets. We are going to have to insert our power supply in from the side. Taking a look at what's included in our case accessory box, it's good to see all the screws are individually packaged. We've got the standoffs if we want to mount our graphics card vertically, and we've got some cable ties. And we've got a nice diagram in the manual which tells us which screws to use where. Okay, so we're now going to start work on the motherboard, and we're going to install our CPU, the bracket for our CPU cooler, the RAM, and our M.2 SSD before we put the motherboard into the case. To install our CPU, we're going to need to open our socket cover. So to free the lever up, we're going to push it down and out, and then all the way up towards the middle of the motherboard, and then we should simply be able to open the socket cover up. We can then set our CPU into the socket, making sure the text is the correct way up, and you'll notice with little notches at the top and the bottom which are going to line up with the CPU. Once we're happy the CPU is sitting correctly in the socket, we can close the cover down again. And then as we close this lever, the black bit of plastic should pop off. If it doesn't pop off, we can simply just pull it from the bottom to free it up. Next, we need to install our M.2 SSD, so to remove the heatsink, we're going to need to remove the two screws. We can then insert our M.2 drive into the socket at a slight angle, wiggling it into place. And then you'll notice when we flatten it down, the same screw that's going to secure our heatsink in place is going to secure our drive in place. Just before we reattach our heatsink, we have some plastic protection on the back which we need to remove. We're now ready to install our RAM, so we're going to need to open the clip on the second and fourth RAM slot along from the CPU. We can then line our RAM up with the slot. Once we're happy the RAM is lined up, it's just some firm pressure to the top and it's going to clip into place. And then the same thing with our second stick, line it up with the slot, and again once we're happy it's lined up, some firm pressure and it's going to clip into place. Next we need to install the brackets for our CPU cooler. So the first thing to do is to remove the stock clips. They're each held on with two screws. Then with our AIO we've got these little clips, so they simply just slot over the back plate. And you'll notice there's an arrow on it with the CPU pointing towards the middle, so make sure you install it the correct way round. And then we've got one for the bottom as well. And then we're going to use the original 4 screws to secure that into place. Next we can set the motherboard into the case, lining it up with the standoffs at the back. And then we can secure the motherboard into place using the screws from the case accessory box. Next we've got our case cables to plug in. Our HD audio cable is going to go into this header down the bottom left of the motherboard. So we can bring it through the cutout, line it up with the header and push into place, and then we'll pull the excess cable through to the back. We've got a system fan header down at the bottom, so we're going to bring the 3-pin cable coming from our rear fan through and plug it in to the header, and then again bring the excess cable through to the back. Next to it we've got another system fan header, so I'm going to bring one of our front fans through, line it up with the header and push into place. Our front panel connectors are going to go into this header down the bottom right hand side of the motherboard, so we'll bring them through the cutout. And I'm going to make a start with the bottom row working from left to right. Pins 1 and 2 are for hard drive LED positive and hard drive LED negative. Just above that we've got power LED positive and power LED negative. The next 2 headers in the top row are for our power switch. And then again I'm just going to pull the excess cable through to the back. Our USB 3.0 cable is going to go into this header here, so we'll bring it through the cutout, line it up with the header and push into place, and then again we're going to pull the excess cable through to the back. At the back of the case we need to plug in the 3-pin fan connector coming from the front fan, and you'll notice each of the fans has an option to daisy chain them together. So I've already plugged this end into the motherboard, so I'm just going to daisy chain the other front fan into it. Okay, next thing for us to do is to get the ARGB on the fans connected up. And coming from our case's built-in controller, we've got these 3 RGB cables. So we remove the protective covers. You'll notice we've got 2 4-pin connectors and one 3-pin 5-volt ARGB header. So we're going to need to plug our fans into the ARGB header, so I'll put the plastic protectors back on the other two. So we've got two options for connecting up our ARGB fans. If we want the case's buttons to control the lighting on them, we're going to need to plug them into this header here coming from the case's controller. The alternative is to plug them directly into the motherboard to allow our motherboard to control them. I'm happy to let the case controller control them, so I'm going to plug the first fan into here. And what you'll notice is each of these fans, you are able to daisy chain them, so we can remove the protective cover from our rear fan. And then if we take one of the ARGB cables coming from the front fan and join it together. Remove the protective cover from it. And then if we take the ARGB cable coming from our second front fan and join it into here. So that way we're going to have the case's ARGB controller able to control all three of the fans. And if we take a look, we've got another cable coming here, which is another protective cover on it. So we have another 3-pin 5V ARGB header here. So I'm going to be able to plug the AIO into here and have all the lighting on all the fans lining up nicely, being controlled by the case's controller. To get the case's controller to work, we're going to need to plug this SATA cable coming from it into our power supply when we install it. So next thing to do is get our power supply installed. Now importantly, this is our power supply's intake fan, so we only want to install it facing down the way. The other thing our power supply has is this screen on it where it's going to be able to display the system information. So again, we're going to want to make sure it's facing the front so it can be seen through the cutout in the case. So that means installing our power supply this way round. And then we can secure the power supply into place at the back. Next thing to do is get our power supply cables plugged in, and our two 8-pin EPS cables are going to go into this header at the top left of the motherboard. So we can go ahead and bring them through the cutout, line them up with the header and push into place. And then we'll pull the excess cable through to the back. You'll notice I haven't used white cable extensions for these cables because once we put the radiator at the top, we're not going to be able to see them. Then we've got our 24-pin cable, which is going to go into this header here. So we'll bring the cable through the cutout, line it up with the header and push into place. And we've got some cable combs on the cable to help organise it. We also need to plug in the USB cable coming from our power supply. So we've got two USB 2.0 headers here down at the bottom of the motherboard. So we'll bring the cable through the cutout, line it up with the header and push into place, and then again pull the excess cable through to the back. And then we just need to plug the SATA cable coming from our case into the SATA cable coming from our power supply. We are now ready to start work on the AIO, so we can set the fans onto the radiator. Now importantly, this is going to be the back, so make sure you have the cables coming out the back. And then we're going to use 8 of these long radiator screws to secure the fans to the radiator. Coming from each of our fans, we've got a 4-pin PWM connector, and ASUS include this double splitter cable which we need to plug these into. There we go. And that then leaves us just one 4-pin PWM connector to plug into our CPU fan header. Also coming from each of the fans, we've got a 3-pin 5V ARGB connector, and ASUS include this 4:1 ARGB cable. So we can go ahead and plug each of the fans into this cable. There we go. This is then either going to go into an ARGB header on our motherboard, but for us I'm probably just going to plug it into the case's controller to have it controlling all the lighting. We've also got 2 spare ARGB ports should we have additional devices in the case that we want to plug into it. Coming from our pump, we've got 2 cables. One is a USB cable and we're going to plug that into USB 2.0 header on our motherboard, and the other is a 4-pin PWM connector which we're going to plug into our pump header on the motherboard. So I'm just going to pass all our AIO cables through the cutout to the back. And then line the AIO up at the top of the case. And then we're going to secure it into place at the top with 8 of the shorter radiator screws. And then we can replace the top dust filter. We're now ready to install our AIO, so we can go ahead and remove the plastic protection, and you'll notice that we've got thermal paste pre-applied. So it's just a matter of lining the AIO up with the bracket beneath, and then we're going to use 4 of the thumb screws with the little ring in the middle of them. Then I'm just going to route the cables coming from the AIO up to the top of the case and out to the back. And then we're going to be able to remove the plastic protection from the AIO. Then we're going to need to plug the I/O into the CPU fan. So the one over to the left is the CPU fan header, the one to the right is the CPU pump header. So we'll bring the double splitter cable coming from the fans on the radiator through, line it up with the header and push into place. Then we'll bring the 4-pin PWM cable coming from the pump through, line it up with the header and push into place, and then again pull the excess cable through to the back. We've got another USB 2.0 header down at the bottom, so we'll bring the USB cable coming from our pump through the cutout, line it up with the header and push into place, and then pull the excess cable through to the back. At the back of the case we need to plug in our ARGB header coming from the fans on the radiator, and as I mentioned you could plug this into the motherboard if you want, but I want all the ARGB to sync up, so we've got an extra splitter cable here and I'm just going to plug it into here. So I'm just taking a look at the case and I'm not so sure this is going to look great with just two fans at the top. When we put the front panel on it is going to probably look quite empty at the bottom, and in fact it's probably not going to do very much for airflow, but I think for looks it would look better if we had a fan installed down at the bottom. So what I think I'm going to do, I'm going to take the fan at the back and move it to the front, and then I've got one of these ASUS tough fans that ASUS have sent me out for another build, and I'm just going to install it in at the back, and that'll keep the symmetry at the front with the same three fans. Because I've moved the hard drive cage forward, to get the fan to fit in down at the bottom, I'm actually going to have to loosen up the fan above it. So I'm just going to daisy chain the bottom fan into the other two front fans, and then we'll add the ARGB back in as well. And then we'll plug all the three fans back into the ARGB coming from the controller. We can then pass the cables coming from our ASUS fan through to the back. I'm then going to bring our 4-pin PWM connector through to the bottom of the case and plug it into the same header we had the other fan plugged into. And then all we need to do is plug the ARGB cable coming from the fan into one of the other splitter cables coming from our AIO. We're now ready to install our graphics card, so we're going to need to remove the second and third bracket from the top. And then we can open the clip on the top PCIe slot. We can then line our graphics card up with the slot, and once we're happy everything's lined up, it's just some firm pressure to the graphics card and it's going to clip into place. And then we'll secure it into place with the same two screws we removed earlier on. I think our PCIe cables are just going to be too big to bring through this cutout at the bottom, so I'll just bring them straight through from the back. Okay, last thing to do is some cable management. So that's the build complete, and I've gone ahead and set the PC up. If you don't know how to install Windows, the drivers, enter the BIOS, update the BIOS, adjust the BIOS settings, and set up the RGB, I've made a separate video with another ASRock motherboard, and the process for setting everything up is very similar between one motherboard and the next. So I'll put a link to that video in the description and you can check that out if you need to know how to set the PC up. So let's move on to the temperatures. So our CPU idled at 45 degrees and reached a maximum of 90 degrees during 10-minute AIDA64 stability test with all components in the system being stressed. Our GPU idled at 35 degrees and reached a maximum of 71 degrees during the AIDA64 stability test. In terms of noise levels, these were 42 decibels at idle and 52 decibels under load. So moving on to the build experience, building in the case was fairly straightforward given the case's large size. There was two issues that I ran into. The first was that whenever I was trying to pass the large cable extension through the cutout at the bottom, it did get stuck, and actually I couldn't push it in or push it out, and ended up bending a couple of the pins at the bottom of the motherboard. The reason I'd gone for the cutout at the bottom underneath the motherboard was we do have a little rubber grommet at the bottom of the case, but unfortunately this large cable, bridged cable, was never going to fit through that cutout. So if I was reading this again, you can do it if you split the cable up and pass the cables individually, but my advice would be just to pass it over to the side of the motherboard. The only other slight issue I had was with the AIO. This is an absolutely lovely AIO from ASUS. Installing it is absolutely beautiful, and the backplate design that they have that goes onto the motherboard, altering the position of the mounting and using exactly the same brackets on the cooler, is absolutely brilliant. The only slight issue I had was in the software, but I just could not, for the life of me, actually be able to rotate the image on the AIO. If I added my own image in, I was able to rotate it, but using any of the custom effects, I couldn't rotate it. I had installed the tubes. You can see here they're now at the bottom, but when I did the build, they were over to the left-hand side. And the only way that I could get the effects to appear the right way was actually to reinstall it with the tubes at the bottom. So I'm sure there is a way in the software of doing it. I'd spent about half an hour trying to figure it out, and it was the end of a long day of building a PC, and it had enough, and it was much easier for me to reapply the thermal paste and rotate the tubes round. So you're building in the PC, keep your tubes at the bottom, and it's going to save you having to do any rotation in the software. So hopefully you have found this build guide useful. If you have, please remember to give it a thumbs up, and if you're not currently subscribed to the channel, please hit the subscribe button as well. Thanks for watching.